In this section, we're going to look at how the nature of warfare changed between 1500 to 1700, so the early modern period of English history. There are big changes, partly to do with the fact that armies became more trained, full-time and more expensive, but also a big change in weaponry and the development of cannons and muskets, and that changed the tactics and strategies of different armies. So if we start off by looking at the size and composition of armies in this time. The size of armies increased massively from 1650 onwards, with the size of the wars fought rather than individual battles. At the Battle of Landen 1693, there were 130,000 soldiers fighting, but that only made up 25% of the people involved in this war in what is now Belgium. The composition of the armies changed regularly depending on the types of battles fought. Commanders still looked for a ratio of roughly 2:1 of infantry to cavalry, but it depended on whether there were sieges or attacking towns and the types of battles being fought. The armies now included artillery and pioneers to support them, but as I said, it was roughly still 2:1 infantry to cavalry in general. And as we saw before, cannons had been invented before this period, but it was in this period they started to become used more and more in battle. At first, they were still only used in sieges, as they were large and unwieldy and difficult to transport around. However, gradually field artillery got lighter and was developed and used to fight in actual battles. By the 1630s, armies in Europe were using cannon, and these armies included some British mercenaries or British regiments, sometimes up to 90 cannon in one battle. Although these British soldiers came back to England, they were not able to use them in Britain at first, as the technology had not developed to build high quality cannon, and the roads were not good enough to move them around. However, during the English Civil War, both things developed and cannon began to be used. We also see the continuing trend of the dominance of the pike in battle, and in the English armies there was a change from Billmen to Pikemen. So the English government decided to replace their Billmen with armoured pikemen. And if you remember, a bill was a sort of spear which was up to 2 meters long with a hook on the end for hooking cavalry off their horses, whereas a pike was sometimes twice as long as that, up to 4.5 meters long with a spear on the end. Pikemen began to be better equipped. They would have a metal helmet and back and breast, so a metal front bit of armour and back bit of armour, and be armed with a pike 4.5 meters long. And actually they were copying the considered invincible Swiss pikemen, who won many battles from the 1470s onwards. However, at the Battle of Bococca in 1522, Swiss pikemen were defeated by muskets, so units of pikemen were interspersed with musketeers as well to defend them. The other big change in weapons, particularly for the English, was moving from longbows to muskets. Now, development of the matchlock musket started to take over from the longbow in the English army. In many ways, this was quite surprising, because the muskets were still very heavy. In fact, they needed a rest to hold up the end of the gun for when they shot. They were slow to load, firing once every 2 minutes, and their range was still only 100 meters. So in some ways surprising that they started to take over from the very successful longbow. And the replacement did not happen immediately. From the 1520s, English units started to be armed with muskets, but the government only stopped training new archers in 1595. Therefore, the switch from bows to muskets is more of a trend than a single turning point. So why did the musket end up replacing the longbow? There's a whole variety of reasons to do with society, technology, cost, and just new ideas. But the main reasons were the changes in farming methods meant less strong labourers who were strong enough to fire the longbow. What happened was farms went over to having enclosed fields with much more land given over to grazing sheep rather than crops. So less people needed to work the land, meaning less people were strong enough to use the longbow. Similarly, there was a growth in towns at this time, which were not places where archery was practiced, so there were less people in farming who would be practicing archery and could be called upon as longbowmen. Prices had gone up as well due to inflation, so people had to work longer hours and had less time to practice archery. Technology had developed and guns got better, and actually a musket bullet could pierce most armour, and armour was now high carbon steel, which was almost arrow proof. There were new ideas from Europe, so the invincible Swiss pikemen were defeated with large groups of muskets, so people started to see the benefits of muskets and move over to them. And lastly, the cost of musket balls was cheaper than arrows. Thousands of musket balls could be carried in a barrel, whereas a archer could normally carry up to 24 arrows, and each arrow had to be created by a craftsman, unlike the very simple musket balls. The development of firearms also changed the use of cavalry. In the 1540s, the pistol was developed to be used by cavalry on horseback. Basically, muskets were too difficult to use from horseback, so they developed a short-range pistol with a wheel lock to spark the gunpowder. Now, cavalry were now lightly armoured with pistols and swords, and only wore back and breast armour with a helmet by the 1640s, and no armour by 1700. And these pistols were very short guns, only 30 to 60 centimetres long, and they could be fired from one hand. From the 1540s onward, cavalry were trained to ride close to the enemy, shoot their pistols, and then ride back to reload. So you start to see the continued decline of the mass cavalry charge, particularly because of the effectiveness of pikemen in repelling it. You also see the development of the dragoon, or the mounted infantry. They were mounted infantry with arquebuses or muskets, cheap horses and no armour, and they dismounted to fight. Now, in the 100 Years' War, the English had used armies completely mounted on horseback to move around, and the dragoon was simply a development of that. So it wasn't really a new idea, but it became very popular in the 16th and 17th century to give you mobile forces. They were used to harry and skirmish the front lines of the enemy and attack the flanks, so they would often ride up, come off their horse, shoot their guns, and then ride away again to harry and upset the enemy. By the 1700s, this tactic was largely done, and they'd been turned into standard cavalry units armoured with pistols and swords, but the name was still used for these units. Another development was in archery, artillery and fortifications. Now, effectively, the power of cannon changed medieval warfare and meant that armies were able to smash down traditional walls, so castle and town walls were no longer good protection. So in the early 1500s, Italian military engineers developed new walls and worked out how to use cannons for defence. So this included the walls being thicker and lower and filled with earth, so that if a cannon did hit it, the wall could absorb the shock in the earth and would not just be smashed. They also had bastions, as you can see in this picture here, sticking out from the walls, so the defenders had flanking fire positions for cannon and muskets to destroy the attackers. And lastly, they angled the walls so that if a cannon ball did strike it, it was much more likely to strike off. And these new designs helped fortifications last against cannon fire. Particularly in the English-controlled towns of Boulogne and Calais in France, in 1530 to 50, they used these defences to keep away the French. Of course, these developments cost a huge amount of money to build. So why did they spend this money? These castles and towns made countries harder to invade and conquer. We saw in the 100 Years' War how Henry V's success was partly based on conquering Harfleur and having the base in Calais. Actually, controlling castles and towns was still a key tactic at this time. The new technology also meant that a small force could hold up armies for months until they gave up in winter, so castles and towns helped a defending nation fight off their attackers. During the siege of Hertogenbosch in Holland in 1629, the Dutch army of 50,000 took 6 months to defeat the garrison of 3,000 men due to its modern defences, showing that castles and siege warfare were still an important part of battle. Similarly, during the siege of Drogheda in 1649, Oliver Cromwell was not able to defeat the town for 4 months without cannon, but as soon as his cannon came, he was able to defeat it in 6 days, as they only had old-fashioned medieval walls and they were able to smash it down. And in this battle, it had been 3,000 men defending it against 12,000 men. So clearly, technology changed the development of fortifications and the use of castles and towns. So most of the strategy in the 1500s and 1600s was still about the control of castles and towns. However, there were other changes as well. The cavalry still had a role to play, but they were much more likely to be lightly armoured cavalry with pistols or mounted dragoon infantry rather than the heavy cavalry charge. Infantry became a combination of musketeers and pikemen, as you can see in this picture here. This is because pikemen were very useful to see off cavalry and protect the muskets, because cavalry could still ride down musketeers and destroy them. However, pikemen could be destroyed by enemy musketeers or by lightly armoured cavalry riding up till they were in range and shooting their pistols. So the musketeers could ensure that cavalry and enemy muskets could not pepper the pikemen from afar. Now, what effectively normally happened was you'd have the muskets standing in front of the pikes and shooting until the enemy became near. Then they would form back into the line and take up position alongside or slightly behind the pikemen so they could shoot at the enemy while the pike kept them at distance. Technology still also had a large part to play in developing the use of guns. In this picture here you can see a difference between a matchlock musket used at the beginning of this period and the flintlock musket which developed towards the end. Now, matchlock muskets had a slow burning cord, which you can see in this picture here, which lit the gunpowder in the priming pan when the trigger was pulled, pulling it back. This caused several problems. It meant that they had something burning nearby which was dangerous with all the stocks of gunpowder they kept. They had the problem of rain. Rain could make the match go out, effectively wiping out the power of your muskets. And because they actually had a lit bit of cord on them, it gave away their position at night and meant they could not sneak up on any enemies. Now, the flintlock musket was a more effective way of firing a musket. The flint would, again, when you pulled the trigger, fall down onto the steel, and then the sparks would then light in the pan, light the gunpowder, and fire the musket. It was also quicker to load and a lot easier to use in general. However, they were more delicate, more expensive, and so only fully adopted in the 1690s as they became developed better and the technology improved. The last significant invention was the invention of the bayonet. Now, musketeers and pikemen had to be well trained to work together effectively, but it's still quite an inefficient way of using your troops. Effectively, at any one point, half your force would not be being used because either they did not have muskets and so could not fire at the enemy when they were at a distance, or they had muskets and so were not very effective in hand-to-hand fighting. The solution was the invention of the bayonet to turn the musket into a short pike. So a bayonet is a dagger or spear end which you attach to the end of your gun and they can use it like a short spear. At first, these were plug bayonets, which were put in the barrel of the gun after they had finished firing. However, this caused problems. You could not shoot with the plug bayonet in, so effectively they had to fire their guns until the enemy became near, stop, fit the bayonet, and then begin fighting. Now if they were charged by cavalry, they might not have this time to put the plug bayonet in, so they were not too effective. However, later on, the ring bayonet, which fixed on the outside of the barrel by 2 rings, and then even better, the socket bayonet, which would lock on the outside of the barrel, meant the bayonet could be fixed, and they became much more widely used. However, it's interesting because it wasn't just technology that slowed down the use of bayonets. So there are issues around the fact that the ring bayonet and the plug bayonet were not that easy to use, or could slip off, or affected the musketeers. But also, because bayonets had to fit exactly, it only became more widely used when muskets were all developed at the same time and had the same sizes. But lastly, certain generals were not happy about the use of bayonets and felt like muskets and pikemen should be kept separate rather than having this musketeer with a bayonet. So both technology and social attitudes slowed down the use of the bayonet. So in summary, the size of armies increased hugely in this period, and composition varied. They started to involve artillery and the men to work them. So as artillery began to be used by armies, both for sieges and later on in battle. And the improvements in artillery also led to improvements in fortifications, as they tried to ensure they could withstand cannon. And billmen were replaced by pikemen, and longbows were replaced by muskets during this time. Heavily armoured cavalry were replaced by lightly armoured cavalry with pistols, and dragoons armed with guns who would dismount to fight. And pikemen had to be trained to fight with musketeers in their ranks so they could protect each other from enemy troops. Musketeers became more efficient and useful with the invention of the more reliable flintlock musket and the use of the bayonet over time.